70-740, Lesson 15, How to Enable Hyper-V Replication. So, in addition to our regular lesson, let's take a look at the steps that are actually required to implement replication. In other words, create two Hyper-V servers. One is our base server, the other one is going to become our replica server. I've named one Hyper-V host. The second virtual machine I've named Hyper-V Replica. Just that simple. Well, before we can even replicate anything, we have to have something to replicate, right? So let's go ahead. We're going to create a virtual machine, and we're just going to call this test-VM, and we're going to give it a number 10. And we'll make it Gen 2. We'll give it 1024 to start, and we'll allow it to use dynamic memory. We're going to connect it. We've only got one network that we assigned. What I did was I created the same switch infrastructure on both Hyper-V machines. That way, if we turn the replica up, it's going to see the same switch. We're going to create a hard drive. Let's go ahead and we're going to install from a bootable image, and that should be available across our network. Let's do a whack lun-dc1. We should have a software folder there that we can get to, and there we are. And we'll go ahead and we'll let that install from that. We'll finish, and we'll go into settings, and I'm going to turn off the automatic check. Okay, automatic checkpoints is already off. That's fine. That's good. So let's go. We're going to let that start. We'll let that set up. While that's doing, how do you enable Hyper-V replication? Well, let's say, what is Hyper-V replication? It allows you to replicate a Hyper-V VM from one Hyper-V host at your, say, primary site to another Hyper-V host that's at your replica site, maybe for disaster recovery. It's a spare server. So we use a replication engine. We have what's called change tracking. There's a network module. If you're working in a cluster, you have to install the Hyper-V Replica broker server role. Now, we won't discuss that because we're not going to do this in a cluster. That is discussed within the context of the lesson. So to deploy Hyper-V Replica, we've got to enable replication between two Hyper-V hosts. We've got to configure that replication of one or more VMs. And then, of course, you want to test your replication deployment. Now, if you want to do it with encryption, obviously you need to have a certificate. You need to use certificate-based authentication. So you would then need to use an existing X509 version 3 certificate, or you'd have to create self-signed certificates. In either case, the certificate can't be expired or revoked. It has to include both the client and server authentication extensions and an associated private key. Now we're going to go ahead, and what we're going to do is we're going to go into our host, and this is going to be done on both of our Hyper-V hosts. We're going to go into Hyper-V settings, and we're going to go down to replication configuration. And we're going to say enable this as a replica server. We're going to do, like I said, we're going to do this on both systems. What we're going to do also is we're going to use Kerberos because I've joined these to our domain, so we can use Kerberos. We're also going to use certificate-based authentication, so we're going to see if that doesn't work. Let's see if we can select a certificate. Right there we are. This is a certificate that I did request already from our certification authority. So we'll click OK. It's there. And now we're going to allow replication from any authenticated server. We're going to select Browse, and then we're going to go to the root of our C drive, and we're going to create a new folder, and we're going to call it VM Replica. And we're going to select that folder. So that'll be the default location to store those replica files. We're going to select OK, and this will accept our settings. Now, You see this? We need to configure our firewall, because what we're going to do is we're going to allow either or to be our replica, even though we're really not going to. There's a couple different firewall settings that we have to configure, and that's your Hyper-V Replica HTTP listener and your HTTPS listener. So we're going to click OK. We're going to go Tools. We're going to go Firewall with Advanced Security. We're going to select Inbound Rules, and we're going to scroll down until we see that Hyper-V section. And here's our two listeners. We're going to right-click and enable, and right-click and enable, and that's done on this server. Let's go ahead and we're going to go into our other server, and we're going to do the same thing. Hyper-V, replication configuration, enable, use Kerberos, use certificate based. We're going to select that certificate that we already requested and installed. We're going to allow, we're going to browse, we're going to go to the root of our C, we're going to create a new folder, we're going to call it VM Replica. We're going to say select folder, and we're going to click OK. We also have to configure our firewall rules over here, so we'll go Tools, Advanced Security, Firewall. We're going to click Rules, we're going to scroll down, right click and enable, right click and enable, close our firewall rules. There's our settings that we need to go and perform for configuring our host and our replica. Okay, so let's take a look at our VM that I've set up. Now you may notice that my Hyper-V host has changed a little bit. What I did was I closed it and reopened the enhanced session with a little bit higher resolution so that our VM will fit in the screen a little bit better. So here's our test VM. It's configured. What I did was I just simply set up Server 2016 Standard. That's core. I did not do desktop experience. There's no need for the size of it. Obviously the core is going to run a little bit slimmer. We'll go ahead and we'll get our password set up on here. It's going to function just the same. If we were to make this part of our domain, we don't have to manage it from here. We can manage it from another system. We're up and running. And let's just go ahead and we're going to run sconfig, and I want to turn off the Windows updates because I don't need this thing pulling down Windows updates and using up our bandwidth and creating a performance issue, and then it wants to install updates and you got to wait and all that. You know, easier just to do this. While we're in here, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and change the time zone, because obviously when we first set this up it goes to Pacific because that's where Microsoft's at, right? And we'll come down here to Eastern Time. We've got that. Let's see, time is correct. So we've got that. I don't care about the work group or the name, any of that stuff. I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to log off the user. So we're logged off, the VM's running. I'm going to go ahead and close that. We're going to bring our Hyper-V manager back up on our screen. And what we're going to do is we're going to right click on this VM. We're going to go down to enable replication. And here's our replication wizard. So on our wizard screen, in the initial screen, we're going to click next. We're going to say, hey, who is the replica server? Well, we need to tell it who it is, right? Let's see if we can find that. We type in Hyper-V. I'm just going to hit enter. It should give me two options, right? Well, there we are. We're going to select our replica. We're going to click OK. We're going to click next. Now we're going to use encryption, right? So we're going to use 443. Let's select that certificate. We're going to click OK. We're going to go ahead and we're going to click next. And here is our virtual hard disk that we're going to replicate. We're going to click next. How often do we want to send changes? Well, 5 minutes might be good if you're working in a high availability environment and you need to know that this is going to be always up to date. Even 30 seconds. I mean, I'm going to select 15 minutes because we don't need to change it that often. We're going to click next. Now, under the additional recovery points, what we're going to do is we're going to simply maintain only the latest recovery point. Here is what we can do. We could say coverage, we could select create additional hourly, right? So we could do every 24 hours, every 4 hours, every 2 hours, every 1 hour. These would be the recovery points that we could recover from. I'm going to select that 24 hours. Actually, what we're going to do, since we're in a test lab, I'm going to drop this down to 1 hour. We're going to click Next. Now, under the initial replication method, do we want to send it over the network or do we want to use external media? If we were doing this to multiple VMs, if we had an entire virtual infrastructure that we needed to create replicas to, we might want to use external media. We might want to export all them to external media and then import them to the replica. We're going to do it over the network. I'm going to leave that selected just like it is. And we're going to say start replication immediately. We're going to click Next. And it says, hey, here's our summary of how we're going to do it. And as long as everything looks fine, which it does, we're going to go ahead and we're going to say finish. There it goes. Our Hyper-V replication has begun. Let's jump over to our replica. Here it is. There's that same test VM. The state is off. It's turned off. So if we look here, our test VM is running on our Hyper-V host. On our replica, there's the copy. If this Hyper-V fails and our infrastructure goes down, we have disaster recovery. It was just that easy to configure it. Now, was it? I made one change that you did not see. Under the Hyper-V settings, I went into the replication configuration, and what I did was rather than say allow replication from any authenticated server, I specified the Hyper-V-host so that this replica connects from this. Now you can add multiple Hyper-V hosts, so you could have 2, 3, 4, however many Hyper-V hypervisors sending replicas to this one replica server. That's what I did to enable it. But it was just that simple. Modify, you put in the fully qualified domain name, and then as the trust group I used the name, and you see it identifies a group of primary servers. That's all it took. And there's our, let's take a look. If we right click, we go to settings. Here's our same settings. Let's take a look. Replication right here. We could test the failover. Or we could fail, or we could pause, we could extend. These are all the different types of settings that we've got now. We could do a planned failover. We could pause the replication. Let's take a look at the Replication Health. Here we are. Replication Health is normal. Size 7 gigabytes. From, to. How many successful replications have there been? There's been one so far. That's all we've done, right? This is how you enable Hyper-V replication. Thank you for viewing this portion of our lesson 15 in which we actually demonstrated Hyper-V replication in use.